All right, so connected to Tolkien is another author, C.S. Lewis. He is what you would call a Christian apologist, basically someone um, explaining and defending Christianity to the world is maybe a best way to put that. But as a youth, he had been disillusioned with faith, and which was fairly common uh, in the post-war era. People just were shaken by the destruction that they saw and didn't have faith in anything really. And so over as he got into adult life, he became friends with Tolkien, and uh, they were part of a literary group of academics called the Inklings, and they would essentially share their writings with each other and offer support and critiques and those sorts of things. And uh, the stories from his and Tolkien's relationship are that they would just get into these very lengthy conversations well into the night, discussing aspects of theology and just all sorts of things. And so over time, it's through that relationship and his own personal exploration that C.S. Lewis came back to Christianity. And from there, he went on to do a number of well-known uh, writings, the most famous of which as a children's series called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is an allegory, telling a moral tale through a fanciful story. And another one that, among many others, but another, probably the second most famous would be Mere Christianity. That was actually a series of radio broadcasts during World War II used to uplift the nation, and was just important to the people then. And so after the fact, they were compiled into a book that became the Mere Christianity, which is also a really fascinating work in itself. But probably the most famous, at least in our lifetimes, is that of J.K. Rowling. On the level, honestly, maybe the Beatles is the closest version of a cultural export that is on the level of Rowling, or Rowling on the level of the Beatles. It's hard to equate because they're obviously two different media, but it's hugely influential to an entire generation of people, and that's where you kind of see that connection. She completed the first book in 1995 and published in 1997. It was one of those things where she got rejected by quite a number of publishers, and that any of those publishers are still kicking themselves to this day for not signing her as a writer, because she's the most the big best-selling series in history. It's really important to culture today. The seventh book in the series was published in 2007, so it took a full decade there, 1997, 2007, for the voracious readers to get to complete the series. There, it's still memory of these huge lines at bookstores at the time, and people waiting to get their copy, and they would hold, it was almost like the way Black Friday used to be, or people waiting in line to get concert tickets to a once in a lifetime thing. But people wanted to get the copy, and then they would start reading immediately and read all through the night and try to finish an entire Potter book in a day, or that type of thing. That's how it really was a phenomenon. So the initial print of the very first book was just 1,000 copies, and 500 of those went to libraries. And so if you can get your hands on one, I would recommend doing so. They're worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000 today, but over 400 million copies of these books have been sold. The brand itself is worth something like $15 billion, maybe even more now with the release of the recent extended universe type movies. But it really is an international phenomenon. It's translated into 65 languages. And it really is just recognized as sparking a love of reading in a lot of the children that kind of came up in that generation and thereafter. It really was critical. So there's a couple videos here that you can benefit from. Publishing Potter, which talks about the actual process of getting the books done, and also a BBC documentary on the series. So both of those are good. We'll let you explore it in a little bit more detail if you just know the story for it, what it is in itself. Okay, let's move away from literature a little bit here and jump into music. Another area that obviously in the 20th century and recent years has been a lot more particularly influential, but the heritage that comes with British music is still influential in itself. So the oldest form, I keep hitting the mouse and it always jumps backwards. The oldest form is Celtic. Very, very broad term, can mean a lot of things. Refers to groups, identifying as Celts. There's Irish and Scottish variations. I'll leave a couple of videos here so that you can hear, especially a song sung in Gaelic language, a separate language in itself, and also a bagpipe parade. Bagpipes being a very, very ancient instrument that particularly connected to Scotland and Ireland, but still recognized throughout the UK as very much of that British world. Some classical music. Britain isn't exactly a powerhouse in the world of classical music as some European continental countries are, but there are a couple of composers that I'm sure you have heard a bit about. So George Friedrich Handel's Messiah, probably one of the most famous of classical pieces. Every year on a Good Friday, this is sung by the Royal Choral Society, if I can say it correctly. I'll have a video of them here, and if you want to see an updated version, they actually, because everybody has been in quarantine, they actually did a version where each person was singing their part, and then they spliced them all together into a choir, as a lot of choral groups have done. You can check that out on YouTube. Just type in Royal Choral Society and quarantine or something like that, and that will come up. But that's been performed on Good Friday at the Royal Albert Hall every year since 1878. So it was a bit sad for them this year to be able to have to step away from that tradition. I'm sure they'll be excited to be back next year. Handel was born in Germany and moved to Britain in 1712, became a citizen, and became famous in his own time, and ended up being buried in Westminster Abbey. So a pretty sharp rise in status there to be able to be buried in Westminster Abbey, which is a high honor. And Edward Elgar, probably not as himself famous as Handel, but he was writing at the end of the Victorian era, beginning of the 20th. Felt a bit more connected with continental Europe as far as musical style. He was Catholic, not of noble birth, and but he's probably simply famous because of the piece that he wrote, Pomp and Circumstance. And if you don't know it, you've heard it. If you've ever been to any sort of graduation or many other events, there's that famous beginning music that they use at these events. And that's Elgar's music. It lends a sense of grandeur to it. It has sort of a march it is a a type of march that was popular in continental Europe, and he wrote the most famous version of it. But let's move on to something that you will definitely be familiar with. The Beatles. One of the most iconic cultural exports that Britain has and ever will produce, probably. It really was. They really were the sound of an era when it came to the 60s. So they formed as a group in 1960, and even to this day, it's known as Beatlemania. They became famous in the UK, and their music became famous in the US before they ever got here. And then when they actually visited the United States, it was just a phenomenon. People were losing their minds, getting and trying to get to see them. Just revolutionized music in itself. This video we'll put below here is of their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is the original version of what becomes the Tonight Show that we know, became Jay Leno and Jimmy Fallon, that kind of late night show. This was Ed Sullivan, and people even there are losing their minds because of the popularity and just the one of the original boy bands here, but a revolutionary one, and they truly were. That influenced everything from music, but also fashion, hairstyles, all of that. And there's been many, many, many other artists since, none that could rival what the Beatles were in their heyday, but you might recognize a few of these names. Queen, Led Zeppelin, The Who, David Bowie, Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Elton John, just many, many artists, for a small, relatively small island with a, comparatively small population. It produces lots and lots of excellent musicians that have influenced, especially popular in the United States. A few of the recent additions to the hugely popular stars out of the UK, you might recognize a few of these. Adele, I include a video here, I Set Fire to the Rain, but also Sam Smith. Ed Sheeran, just in the last several years, has rocketed in fame to be one of the world's biggest stars, and so just hugely influential. And I'll mention the movie industry. I didn't have a slide for it, but briefly I'll mention the movie industry just because the UK is strong in its ability to produce films. The market for consuming films isn't that small, isn't that large, but a lot of the films that you see that are made there end up being hugely popular in the United States. So all of the Star Wars films are filmed there. All of the Harry Potter films, and many others choose to film there simply because of the heritage and the infrastructure that they have for making movies. And so they do a particularly good job at that. It's a global center for making movies. And I think we'll pause there, and then we will come back and do a section here discussing British television, which is its own unique animal.